Hello and welcome to the fourth and final episode of the Man of Steel podcast, a podcast produced independently by me, Kevin Flaherty, to discuss the Man of Steel himself, Joseph Stalin, and his state ideology of Marxism-Leninism. Through our ruthless criticism of everything Stalinist, we'll hope that with these 4 short episodes, we'll be able to better understand how Papa Joe crafted his quasi-religious Soviet belief system and its effects not only in the USSR, but worldwide. In our first episode, we discussed how Stalin crafted his Soviet belief system based off of Marx. In our second, we covered Stalin's rise to power and how he uses himself and Lenin as theological figures for the masses to follow. In our third episode, we covered how Marxist-Leninist states reproduce this ideology and how said utilization of ideology can lead to mass genocide and repression in the USSR and abroad. Today, for our final episode, to conclude our series on Stalin and his call to personality, we'll be discussing how Stalin impacted the world in the West, particularly movements associated in the United States, France, Italy, and Britain, which attach themselves to Marxist-Leninist theory, or those who attacked Marxism-Leninism from a Marxist perspective. However, to begin, we do discuss the Third Internationale. Now, the Third Internationale was based off of course, the First and Second Internationale. The Third Internationale was also known as the Communist Internationale. It was based primarily off of discussing communist theory and issuing communist policy, so that communist parties worldwide, who had different ranges of influence, could agree on a common platform or strategy on how to bring about a proletarian revolution internationally. Beginning with the First Internationale, just to give a little history, the First Internationale was also known as the International Working Men's Association. It was accompanied by many famous socialists, including Joseph Pierre Proudhon, who was the founder of the thought of anarchism, as well as other socialists, such as, of course, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels themselves, and other anarchists and socialists, such as Mikhail Bakunin, Auguste Blanqui, and of course, the composer of the Internationale that we played at the end of our first episode, Eugene Potier. The First Internationale saw many really important discussions and publications come out of the socialist world. Towards the end of the First Internationale, which was held at the end of the 19th century, the anarchists and the socialists had an official split, the blacks and the reds as they were known, primarily started by a fight between Marx and Bakunin, would not unite. And the question arose primarily from the question of the role of the state in revolution. While Marx believed the proletariat had to create their own sort of state, an anti-state almost, as an antithesis to the bourgeois state, Bakunin viewed the state as suspect, and was paranoid coming from a Russian background that a proletarian state, even if it was formed and was representatory of the proletariat, would end up suppressing the peasantry. This, along with a lot of anti-Semitic remarks against Karl Marx, as Karl Marx's father was of Jewish heritage and converted to Protestantism before he was previously Jewish, and at the time, anti-Semitism was very popular and fervent in Russia. After the end of the First Internationale, eventually Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels would pass on, and who would take up the torch in leading a lot of the conversation in the Second Internationale was Karl Kautsky, and his voice, as well as Bernstein and some who had very particular orthodox conceptions of Marxism, such as Vladimir Lenin, would end up dominating the conversation in the Second Internationale. Now, what's interesting is that what ended the Second Internationale wasn't just a disagreement of opinion, it was actually material circumstances, as whenever World War I broke out, a lot of socialist parties actually ended up supporting their war and supporting their particular nations in the war, including purchasing war bonds and advocating the purchase of war bonds, as well as cutting ties to other international parties, which was extremely anti-Marxist and was almost an embarrassment on the part of the communist world, as of course, Marx's rhetoric at the very end of the Communist Manifesto, perhaps his most famous document, was "Workers of the world, unite," and Marx would say things such as, "Workers know no nation." Now, most of the factions of the Communist Party that actually ended up supporting the war were reformist factions. These were people who believed that through reforming our current bourgeois states, we could achieve a proletarian state or a communist revolution, that the transitionary state from capitalism to socialism could be achieved by peaceful reform. On the other side, those who were against the war were revolutionaries who believed that only violent revolution by the proletariat could actually bring about a dictatorship of the proletariat, which was more traditional to Marxist thinking. However, it's debatable whether or not it was more mainstream at the time in terms of how most people interpreted Marxist theory. So the First World War really ended the Second Internationale. However, whenever the Third Internationale would emerge, with the Soviet Union being the only victorious revolution of the 1918 revolutions, as being headed by the Bolshevik Party, who achieved their power through violent revolution, reform was no longer a question, especially after the betrayal of the working class by the reformist faction of the Communist parties. So the Third Internationale acted as a place where communists of their era between 1920 and 1950 could discuss theory and also sort of engage in an ideological warfare against each other in terms of whose theory and whose strategies for proletarian revolution would reign dominant, including Stalin. Although Stalin had particular advantages being head of the Soviet Union, at the same time, at least earlier on in the Third Internationale, he was still on the same playing field theoretically as everybody else. And his book that he released, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, would be up to a lot of scrutiny. In fact, it was said that upon publishing his book, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, those who were close to him in the party didn't understand what he was talking about. Not necessarily because it was that complex, but because he had purged most of the competent communists within the party. Now, as Stalin's purges would go on, and he would either exile or ignore or even execute those who posed real theoretical challenges to him, there was one man who not only survived Stalin, but outright labeled him as the gravedigger of the communist revolution to his face during the Third Internationale. His name was Amadeo Berdiga, and he published many works, including dialogues with Stalin to the fundamentals of revolutionary communism. He was extremely shrewd, extremely intelligent, and sort of acted as the thorn in Stalin's side whenever it came to Stalinist theory amongst intellectuals and communist theoreticians. In fact, he claimed that Stalin at this point, through exploiting the working class, was now just a capitalist, and made audacious claims within the communist community, such as that the USSR had now transitioned to what could be considered a capitalist state. And his followers, who were known as left communists for being left of Stalin, would continue to issue these criticisms within the sanctuary of the Western world, somewhat out of Stalin's reach. However, while Berdiga was particularly anti-Stalinist, there were those in the West who were considered extremely progressive, usually intelligentsia, who were either sympathetic to outright supporting completely the USSR. This included a lot of French philosophers whose theories to this day are still influential, such as the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, who met with Fidel Castro and believed in Marxist-Leninist theory and in the ability for Marxist-Leninist states to bring about communism. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre was no random philosopher. In fact, whenever he was in prison, the French prime minister allowed him to go free, saying, "You do not arrest Voltaire." Another famous French philosopher, Michel Foucault, who's considered one of the founders of postmodern philosophy, was an adamant Maoist and Marxist-Leninist and participated in many demonstrations in support of the USSR. From the 1940s until the 1970s, the PCF, also known as the French Communist Party, received over a quarter of the votes in general elections. However, bringing it closer to home in the United States certainly saw a fair amount of organizations which remained sympathetic to USSR, primarily because the United States found itself in direct opposition to the USSR, and those who saw themselves as oppressed or subjugated to the rule of a despotic government, such as many groups of African Americans, looked to the USSR as an alternative, and communism as an alternative, to the racism that they were really feeling in the US. In particular, the Black Panther group, which was a group that was made to defend African American communities, were at the same time revolutionary Maoist and believed that black people had to rise up in arms and arm themselves against the United States government in defense of their communities, as well as to conquer political power for those communities. Even Malcolm X, a famous civil rights activist, at the end of his life was extremely sympathetic towards Marxist-Leninist ideas and towards the Soviet Union. And finally, to conclude our podcast, I'd like to discuss, or mention rather, Paul Robson, an actor, singer, and political activist who was extremely sympathetic towards the Soviet Union. In fact, he had visited it multiple times and wrote essays on how he felt truly like a free man in the Soviet Union compared to America, where racism, lynching, and Jim Crow laws were extremely prevalent. In fact, to play us out this very last time, instead of using music, I'm going to take a speech from Paul Robson, as he was at the House of Un-American Activities Committee, and I urge listeners to pay attention to his rhetoric, not only how he occasionally dodges questions, but how he's extremely charismatic, and in some cases somewhat justified in his defense against the McCarthyism that was brought against him, in an effort to criminalize him for his ideas and his political activism against the United States and for civil rights. And with this final speech / testimony by Paul Robson, I'd like to thank you for joining us for the last episode of the Man of Steel podcast. For all scholarly sources, be sure to check out the show notes in the description. Thank you for listening, and remember to like, comment, and share this independent and entirely non-profit podcast, brought to you by yours truly, Kevin Flaherty.
Now, Mr. Robson,
do I have the privilege of asking who is addressing me?
I'm Richard Ahrens.
What is your position?
I'm director of the staff. Did you file a passport application in July 2, 1954?
I filed about 25 in the last few months.
In July of 1954, were you requested to submit a non-communist affidavit?
Under no conditions would I think of signing such an affidavit. It is a contradiction of the rights of American citizens.
Are you now a member of the Communist Party?
Oh, please. Please.
Please answer, will you, Mr. Robson?
What is the Communist Party? What do you mean by that?
Are you now a member of the Communist Party?
Would you like to come to the ballot box when I vote and take out the ballot and see?
Mr. Chairman, I respectfully suggest the witness be directed to answer the question.
You are directed to answer the question.
I invoke the Fifth Amendment and forget it.
I respectfully suggest the witness be directed to answer the question whether, if he gave us a truthful answer, he would be supplying information which might be used against him in a criminal proceeding.
You are directed to answer, Mr. Robson.
In the first place, wherever I have been in the world, the first to die in the struggle against fascism were the communists. I laid many wreaths upon the graves of communists. That is not criminal. Chief Justice Warren has been very clear that the Fifth Amendment does not have anything to do with the influence of criminality, and I invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Have you ever been known under the name of John Thomas?
Oh, please, does somebody here want me to put up a perjury someplace? John Thomas, my name is Paul Robson, and anything I have to say, I have said in public all over the world, and that is why I'm here today.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that you direct the witness to answer the question. He's making a speech.
I ask you to affirm or deny the fact that your Communist Party name was John Thomas.
I invoke the Fifth Amendment. This is really ridiculous.
The witness talks very loud when he makes a speech, but when he invokes the Fifth Amendment, I can't hear him.
I have medals for diction. I can talk plenty loud.
Will you talk a little louder?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment loudly.
Sir, who are Mr. and Mrs. Vladimir
I
Nikiev?
invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Do you know a Manning Johnson?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Do you know Gregory Kifitz?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Do you know a Max Jurgen?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Max Jurgen.
Why don't you have
oath.
these people here to be cross-examined? Could I ask whether this is legal?
This is not only legal, but usual. By unanimous vote, this committee has been instructed to perform this very distasteful task.
To whom am I talking?
You're speaking to the chairman of the committee.
Mr. Walter?
Yes.
The Pennsylvania Walter?
That is right.
Representative of the steel workers?
That is right.
And the coal mining workers?
That is right.
Not United States Steel by any chance. A great patriot.
That is right.
You are the author of the bills that are going to keep all kinds of decent people out of the country.
No, only your kind.
Colored people like myself. And you would let in the Teutonic Anglo-Saxon stock.
We are trying to make it easier to get rid of your kind, too.
You don't want any colored people to come in. Could I be allowed to read from my statement?
Will you just tell this committee, please, while under oath, Mr. Robson, the communists who participated in the preparation of that statement?
Oh, please. The reason I'm here today, from the mouth of the State Department itself, is I should not be allowed to travel because I have struggled for the independence of the colonial peoples of Africa. The other reason I'm here today, again, from the State Department and from the record of the Court of Appeals, is that when I am abroad, I speak out against injustices against the Negro people in this land. That is why I'm here. I'm not being tried for whether I'm a communist. I'm being tried for fighting for the rights of my people, who are still second-class citizens in this country, in this United States of America. My mother was born in your state, and My mother was a Quaker. My ancestors, in the time of Washington, baked bread for George Washington's troops when they crossed the Delaware. My father was a slave. I stand here struggling for the rights of my people to be full citizens in this country. And we are not. We are not in Mississippi. We are not in Montgomery, Alabama. We are not in Washington. We are nowhere. And that is why I am here today. You want to shut up every Negro who has the courage to stand up and fight for the rights of his people, for the rights of workers. And I have been on many a picket line for the steel workers too. And that is why I'm here today.
Would you tell us whether or not you know Thomas W. Young?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Thomas W. Young is a Negro president of the Guide Publishing Company. I'd like to read you his testimony, quote, Paul Robson has no moral right to place in jeopardy the welfare of the American Negro to advance a foreign cause. In the eyes of the Negro people, this false prophet is unfaithful to their country, and they repudiate him, close quote. Do you know the man that said that?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment now. Can I read my statement? It is a sad and bitter comment.
While you were in Paris in 1949, Mr. Robson, did you tell an audience the American Negro would never go to war against the Soviet government?
May I say that is slightly out of context? May I explain to you what I did say? I remember the speech very well. 2,000 students who came from populations that would range to 600 or 700 million people asked me to say in their name that they did not want war. No part of my speech in Paris says 15 million American Negroes would do anything. I said it was my feeling that the American people would struggle for peace, and that has been since underscored by the President of these United States. Now, in passing, I said...
Do you know any people who want war?
Listen to me. I said it was unthinkable to me that any people could take up arms in the name of a man like Senator Eastland of Mississippi against anybody. Gentlemen, I still say that. This United States government should go to Mississippi and protect my people. That is what it should do.
I lay before you, sir, an article, quote, I am looking for full freedom, unquote, by Paul Robson in The Worker. July 3rd, 1949, quote, I said it was unthinkable that the Negro people of America or elsewhere could be drawn into war with the Soviet Union. I repeat it with 100-fold emphasis, they will not, close quote.
And, gentlemen, they have not. It is clear that no Americans are going to go to war with the Soviet Union.
While you were in Stockholm, did you make a little speech?
I made all kinds of speeches.
Let me read you a quotation.
Let me listen.
Do so, please.
I am a lawyer.
It would be a revelation if you would listen to counsel.
In good company, I usually listen. But you know, people wander around in such fancy places.
You said, Mr. Robson, and I quote, I belong to the American resistance movement, which fights against American imperialism, just as the resistance movement fought against Hitler.
Just like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were underground railroaders and fighting for our freedom, you bet your life.
I have to insist that you listen to these questions.
I am listening.
I quote further, why should the Negroes ever fight against the only nation in the world where racial discrimination is prohibited and where the people can live freely? Never. They will never fight against either the Soviet Union or the people's democracies, close quote. Did you make that statement?
I do not remember, but what is perfectly clear today is that 900 million people, other colored people, have told you they will not. 400 million in India and millions everywhere have told you that.
The witness has answered the question. He doesn't need to make a speech.
Did you write an article that was published in the USSR Information Bulletin?
Yes.
Quote, I want to emphasize that only here in the Soviet Union did I feel that I was a real man with a capital M, close quote.
I would say, what is your name?
Errant.
I am quite willing to answer the question. When I was a singer years ago, and this you will have to listen to.
I am listening.
I am a bass singer, so for me, it was Chelyabin, the great Russian bass, not Caruso the tenor. I learned the Russian language to sing their songs. I wish you would listen now.
Mr. Chairman, I ask you to direct the witness to answer the question.
Just be fair with me.
I ask for order.
The great poet of Russia is of African blood.
Let us not go
It
so
is
far
important to
afield.
explain this.
Did you make that statement?
When I first went to Russia in 1934...
Did you make that
When I
statement?
first went to Russia in
Did you
1934...
make that statement?
In Russia, I felt for the first time like a full human being. No color prejudice like in Mississippi. No color prejudice like in Washington. It was the first time I felt like a human being, where I did not feel the pressure of color as I feel it in this committee today.
Why do you not stay in Russia?
Because my father was a slave, and my people died to build this country. And I'm going to stay here and have a part of it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?
You are here because you are promoting the communist cause.
I am here because I'm opposing the neo-fascist cause, which I see arising in these committees. Jefferson could be sitting here, and Frederick Douglass could be sitting here. Eugene Debs could be sitting here.
Now, what prejudice are you talking about? You were graduated from Rutgers. You were graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. I remember seeing you play football at Lehigh. There was no prejudice against you.
Just a moment. This is something I challenge very deeply, that the success of a few Negroes can make up for $700 a year for thousands of Negro families in the South. My father was a slave, and I have cousins who are sharecroppers. I do not see success in terms of myself. I have sacrificed hundreds of thousands of dollars for what I believe in.
While you were in Moscow, Mr. Robson, did you make a speech lauding Stalin?
I can't remember.
Have you recently changed your
What has
mind about
happened
Stalin?
to Stalin, gentlemen, is a question for the Soviet Union, and I won't argue with a representative of the people who, in building America, wasted the lives of my people. You are responsible, you and your forebears, for 60 to 100 million black people dying in the slave ships and on the plantations. Don't you ask me about anybody.
I'm sure you wouldn't want to discuss with us the slave labor camps in the
Nothing
Soviet
could be built
Union.
more on slavery than this society, I assure you.
I would invite your attention to the Daily Worker of June 29, 1949, with reference to a get-together with you and Ben Davis, formerly communist councilman in New York. Do you know Ben
One
Davis?
of my dearest friends. He is as patriotic an American as can be, and you, gentlemen, are the non-patriots.
Just a minute.
You are the un-American.
The hearing is now adjourned.
I think it should be.
I've been doing all of this that I can.
Can I read my statement?
No! The meeting is adjourned.
It should be.